Augustinian Reflections on the Limits of Natural Agathology. Introduction. Christian philosophers from St. Paul to today maintain that we can have moral knowledge through experience of the natural world. Natural agathology, like natural theology, is possible. But what are its limits when it comes to giving a philosophical account of an answer to the following question: who is a good person? This paper begins by offering some reflections on the limits of natural agathology from St. Augustine's Confessions, Book 7, and then it moves in 5 parts. First, I argue that natural reason can partially answer the question, what is good? What is a person? Who is a good person? And second, I consider several claims made in Augustine's Confessions regarding what he takes to be the limits of natural agathology in answering the questions from the first part of the paper. Third, I consider a way of thinking about competing putative religious revelation claims as a problem-solving activity, a type of inference to the best explanation, as supplemental to natural agathology given its limits. Fourth, I consider several desiderata of how Christian revelation fares as a supplement to natural agathology in comparison to temporary non-Christian religiously live options in terms of their scope, fecundity, explanatory power, historicity, and social application. Fifth, I conclude with some thoughts on how natural agathology and supernatural agathology ought to be related within metaethical philosophy of religion. 1. Natural agathology as rational metaphysics. What is good? In this portion of the paper, I will not argue, but rather assume that Aquinas' 4 ways to good, his arguments that being and good are identical, idem secundum rem, are sound. If these arguments fail, or if the conclusion is false, then either another route to natural agathology must be found, or the enterprise given up entirely. Even if either of these options should be the case, I don't think it necessarily impinges on what we will examine from Augustine's Confessions below in section 2. In other words, any failure in a positive case for natural agathology, again by natural I don't mean naturalistic, I simply mean knowable non-supernaturally or by a non-revelatory means, that does not entail that there's a natural limitation of any such natural agathology. The limits of natural agathology are independent from any positive case for natural agathology. But for now, the answer to the question, what is good, is this: being is identical to good in things, and being should be understood as essential exemplification. What is a human person? Since a human person has being, and since being and good are identical, then necessarily any existent human person is good insofar as they exist. Yet given that being is essential exemplification, then to specify goodness of the essential nature of human persons, we need to specify the essential features of a human person's essential nature. It's hard to deny from our experience of ourselves that human persons are hylomorphic body and soul composites. We have the following features true of us, given the things we are: rationality, volitionality, relationality, and corporeality. Given these features, and perhaps others, we can now say who a good person is. So, who is a good person? From what follows, I'll assume that a good person is one who fulfills their essential nature, that goodness and being are identical. Aquinas' 4 ways to good purport to show, but the explanation alone of a human essential nature is not as such the full teleological manifestation of that essential nature. That, of course, following Aristotle, among many in the Western philosophical tradition, requires time, effort, habituation, and certain external goods, for example, the polis, friendship, a complete life, good health, etc. An account of the virtues and their role in the teleological fulfillment of essential human nature will also be required here, again assuming that this view of a good person is reasonable. Assuming that the description of what good is, what a human person is, and who is a good person are reasonably known from evidence from general revelation, we now have the basis for a natural agathology. Of course, these assumptions must be reasonably spelled out at length, and objections to them need to be addressed with reasonable rejoinders. But the purpose of this paper is not to offer such an account, but rather to consider what the limits of such natural agathology would be. All right, section 2. Augustinian limits to natural agathology. The story of human bonum goodness begins with an initium, a starting point which is found in our mere existence. It proceeds from an infimum, bonum goodness of having, then expressing to a greater and greater extent the capacities of our human nature outwardly through the cultivation of human virtues, which point to a summum goodness or bonum. The questions that now arise for a natural agathology like that described above are, what is the summum bonum and how do we achieve it? So Christian philosophers have recognized that there are upper epistemic limits of our knowledge of human goodness, of our natural knowledge of the human summum bonum. For example, in Confessions, Book 7, Chapter 9, Augustine lists 4 items of natural knowledge that he discovered from the Platonist readings, which he came across. This is really Neoplatonist, but it's okay. We don't need to quibble with that here. These items of knowledge are known by natural reason, and while true, indicate the limitations of our knowledge of human goodness. Simultaneously, they point to the possibility of knowledge beyond, but not contradictory to, human reason. These examples from Augustine indicate that there is a natural teleology of our noetic faculties as part and parcel of our natural agathology, probably beginning with our rational capacities, that desires to be fulfilled in something beyond the natural world. These 4 ideas illustrated by Augustine are ones that he recognized in his readings of the Platonists and Neoplatonists. Now, while there are significant differences between Platonic, Aristotelian, and Neoplatonic natural agathologies, they agree that knowledge of the good and being good persons is possible naturally, at least to an extent. I think that the 4 things that Augustine points out as items of knowledge from those he calls the Platonists can also apply to the more Aristotelian versions of natural agathology described above, with appropriate changes in specific text references from Aristotle's works. According to Augustine, natural reason gives us at least 4 things, but for each of these 4 things natural reason can give us about natural goodness, there's also a corresponding failure of reason to fulfill or complete these 4 things as well. Let's look at these each in turn. First, natural reason can tell us what the word, or logos, qua God, exists, that we are not God, and that the logos enlightens every man. But it cannot tell us that the Word entered into humanity and gave us the right to become children of God. The entrance of the Word into humanity is only known through the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Notice too here the familial aspect of special revelation, which, I think as we'll consider below, is a unique point of Christianity in comparison with other religious alternatives. Let's call this first failure, F1, the failure of the individual divine relation, a relational failure of natural agathology. Second, natural reason can tell us that we can see that the Word, or logos, was begotten from God, but it could not tell us that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Note here the specific corporeality of the incarnation, and the humanity of Christ is emphasized. This will be especially salient for the way in which our human essential nature is bound up with Christ's 2 natures in the beatific vision, understood as the summum bonum for human persons. Call this F2, failure 2. This is a failure of natural agathology to tell us how our corporality is related to abstract nature of good. Call this a corporeal failure of natural agathology. Third, natural reason can tell us that the Word, or logos, was equal to God, and was in his nature himself God. But it could not tell us that the Word condescended, incarnated, emptied himself, died on a cross, rose again, was exalted, and must be confessed by us. This requires the historical reality of the incarnation, and is a matter known through the real events of history, not by rational philosophical speculation. Call this F3. This is a failure of natural agathology to tell us the connection of the summum bonum with real human history, as opposed to mere speculative abstract rationality. This is the historical failure of natural agathology. Fourth, natural reason can tell us that the Word is of such an eternal nature, such that for our soul to be blessed, true human goodness, it must participate in that divine wisdom. Note the historical parallels with Plato's idea of the good, and that blessedness requires a vision of it. This is a theme developed by Boethius in the Consolation of Philosophy. But that rational participation in the good, that alone cannot tell us that it is Jesus' death for us sinners and his being given up for us on the cross that is the only route to obtaining this participation in the divine life of a personal Trinitarian Godhead. Call this F4. This failure has to do with the end, not with regard to our natural teleology, which points to a supernatural fulfillment in God, but rather the consummation of our telos eschatologically. Call this an eschatological failure. From these four things and their concomitant failures, F1 through F4, it is clear, according to Augustine, that the summum bonum, the complete fulfillment of the human telos, is found in that which is consistent with, but also beyond the ken of natural reason. Natural agathology is reasonable, and its application to human life. It has limits, though, and failures in its scope. With respect to our search for the summum bonum, the fourth point that Augustine makes is most salient here. Participation in the divine wisdom that goes back again to Plato's Republic is of particular interest for the natural agathological approach. Plato is right as far as it goes, something you'll hear me say often. Seeing the good is the basis of a possible summum bonum, but the lacuna in the Platonic system is manifest in the allegory of the cave. If we are like those in the cave, then how does the first person get out? The Republic begins, as you know, with "I went down." But if Socrates is the one who leads us out of ignorance to the good, how did Socrates get out? How did Socrates get out of the cave? Plato asks us to suspend disbelief here and suppose that something like a freeing of the soul in the journey to the good could happen by nature. But that's a big supposition. What if the good didn't stay in Plato's heaven? What if the good were a human person who entered human history, incarnated, lived, died, resurrected, and was exalted? Suppose that this occurred in such a way as to make the hope of a corporeal resurrection such that all the capabilities of being human, including our corporeality, or somality, to follow the Greek term soma from 1 Corinthians 15:44, could reach its ultimate telos. This is not merely philosophical speculation, like Plato asks us to believe in the allegory of the cave. Allegories, the Gospels, most certainly are not. They are historical realities. Given the truth of the Gospels, we must now seek for the summum bonum on God's terms, not merely on the basis of natural knowledge of the good. There is a good beyond the good of natural agathology, the good revealed in Jesus Christ. So let's consider these four failures of natural agathology as gaps that point to the possibility of the fulfillment by revelation. Assuming these failures are real failures and that they actually point to the possibility of fulfillment, then we can elaborate on what kind or type of religious revelation would be required to complete these gappy failures. Let's look at these failures in turn. First, the relational failure. This is a failure of the individual divine relation. Natural agathology might point to the divine as the goal of the human fulfillment, of the telos of an individual's goodness. But it cannot by itself specify how the individual relates to the divine. Thus, any revelation that attempts to ameliorate this failure must clarify the nature of the relationship between the individual and God. F2. The corporeal failure is a failure to tell us how our bodies are related to our ultimate telos, given two things. First, there's a corporeal abstractor question. How do we make sense of the relation of our corporeality, an essential feature of being human, and the abstract nature of good, a corporeal abstracta failure? Second, there's a corporeal immortality question. How do we make sense of the relation of our corporeality, an essential feature of being human, and the fact that we die and our bodies return to the earth of which they are composed, on the assumption that our immaterial features continue in a personal existence after our corporeal demise? Again, this is something that even Plato thought was possible, even in the Republic. You might not think the arguments are very good there, but he certainly thought you'd give rational arguments for the immortality of the disembodied soul, the disembodied person. Any putative divine revelation closing the gap at this failure must address the relation between our corporeality and the abstract nature of the good, and our relationship of it, and our relationship to it, both here and now and after death. Let's look at the third failure, F3. The historical failure is a failure to tell us what the connection between the summum bonum with real human history, as opposed to mere speculative abstract rationality. Given that human persons are concrete, unrepeatable historical realities, it seems that our search to be good will obtain in a concrete historical time frame, assuming that time and individual personal existence extends into the future, whether embodied or disembodied. While reason can tell us speculatively how to obtain goodness, it seems that what we need is a teleological roadmap that lives in history and is not detached from it. Thus, any religion's revelation must account for the historicity of human life and offer real solutions to our temporality. Let's look at F4, the eschatological failure. This is a failure to give any clear consummative end, even given our natural teleological end. It is a failure to say precisely what we'll be doing, how we will be existing as good persons for eternity. Any religious revelation will need to specify what the consummation of our natural end entails. Now, Plato's attempt to do this in the so-called myth of Ur is one such attempt given by a philosopher. But again, if you want to call that like mythological special revelation, yeah, you could call it that. But what if somebody really did come back from the dead, like Jesus, that we have good evidence for, not just a myth, like Ur? So the task of the philosopher is not to provide the content of these failures. In fact, if Augustine and Aquinas, among many Christian philosophers, is right, then the philosopher qua philosopher cannot ameliorate these four failures. The philosopher, especially the Christian philosopher, serving as a Christian apologist, can, however, help to evaluate rationally whether the competing putative religious revelation claims can ameliorate the failures of natural agathology. The philosopher can serve as a kind of referee in a problem-solving activity, abductive competition, between or among competing special revelation claims, as they seek to overcome the limitations of natural agathology. Let's consider a brief way that this might work. So let's consider, this is section 4 of the paper, let's consider several desiderata of how Christian revelation fares as a supplement to natural agathology when compared to contemporary or other religious non-Christian live options. Doing so might be thought as a merely comparative philosophy of religion. However, philosophy as its practice in the Western tradition is a truth-seeking activity. Philosophy seeks the truth, beliefs that correspond to reality, regarding the nature of reality, knowledge of goodness, which is our focus here, and beauty. Knowledge and goodness, which is our focus here, and beauty. Philosophers should go beyond mere comparative work. They should seek to find the truth of the matter regarding whether religious claims fill the gaps in natural agathology. We should move from comparative philosophy of religion to polemical philosophy of religion. Now, religion is often described in terms like these in standard collegial introduction or comparative religion textbooks. Here's one. It's from William Young's The World's Religions. The World's Religions. Religion is human. So this is his description. I don't think it's quite a definition. More of a description of what religions are. Quote, religion is a human transformation in response to perceived ultimacy. I think there's a decent way to express the idea that religious revelation claims offer solutions to the four failures of natural agathology: relational, corporeal, historical, and eschatological. Christianity, qua religious revelation, will, of course, attempt to do this in its own unique way. Let us consider the Christian responses and then maybe just hint at some surfacey comparisons to other options. So F1, the relational failure might be characterized by the human person's need for love. The gap between God and man is a relational gap of love for creator to creature. On a Christian understanding of love, God is love. According to Christian revelation, God is a trinity, one God, three persons, who eternally exist in a loving familial relationship, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. God's love moves him to create free beings that have the capacity to reject him. This is what severs us from God's love and entails both physical and spiritual death. Sorry, it's not God's love that does it's our exercise of free will away from God, our own fault of sin. So this leads us to the failures 2, 3, and 4, which I want to generalize here as the problems of sin, human inability to be good when we know that we should be good, and death, our corporeal mortality. The Christian solution to F1 is also the basis for the Christian solution to F2, 3, and 4. God solves the problem of sin and death for us by the Son, by Jesus, taking on human nature, by teaching us how to live in a right relationship to God and taking upon himself as a sinless being the consequences of our sin. He dies physically in our place so that we don't die spiritually, and is raised bodily so that we may be so as well. He gives us the freedom, grace, by the Holy Spirit living within our soul, here and now, in order to live in a loving familial relationship with God now and forever. God becomes our Father, because Jesus is our brother, and our union with the triune God, the personal Godhead, through the Holy Spirit, as the intentional with an S, start of the beatific vision, coupled with the extensional reality of a spiritual, corporeal, resurrected body, gives us an eschatological vision of perfected human goodness. So, how does the Christian solution through Jesus compare to other religions? Instead of looking at all four of these, let's just consider love, sin, and death taken together. I take it that Christianity, in comparison with the other major world religions, fulfills all of these in ways that are unique, not just unique to Christianity, but actually serve as a way of fulfilling the failures of natural agathology in a way that other world religions cannot. Now, for the comparative philosophy of religion, the patient argumentation, the polemical detail with regard to each of the other world's major religions and other options, even offshoots of Christianity, this might be the kind of thing that a philosopher of religion can undertake. And I'm not going to do that here in this paper, but that's something you want to think about. So, given comparative philosophy of religious attempts to complete the gaps in natural agathology, how should a philosopher decide or encourage others to decide which one to choose and why? In other words, if you line up all of these special revelation claims across the different worlds of religions and then put Christianity in that mix, how do you decide which one to pick? Now, one time I heard a philosopher say, well, you just go with whichever one has the most moving story and narrative. Well, you could do that. But I was thinking more like, why don't you find which one's true? Like which one corresponds to reality. And so think about those four gaps that we looked at, those four gaps in natural agathology that Augustine points out. Then line up all the world of religions, including Christianity, look at their special revelation claims, find which ones fulfill those gaps better than others, and then also look at the truth claims made by those religions. And the ones that are true and fulfill the gaps, those are the ones you should go with or think about philosophically in order to decide how to live well. So first, I'd recommend any serious inquirer should rationally consider the evidence for the truth of Christian claims. Does God exist? Was Jesus God? Did he rise from the dead? Second, carefully compare the potential solutions among the religions, especially with regard to their scope, fecundity, explanatory power, historicity, and social application. Each of these areas might require a full paper or book, a lifetime of study maybe, on their own, but it might serve as a rational grounding for any attempt to decide among competing revelation claims. Third, one might prayerfully undertake a devotional experiment along the lines of Matthew 7:7-29. Seek, right? Seeking God and finding. This might serve as an empirical confirmation for the relevant revelation claims under consideration. All right, let's wrap up here. Natural and supernatural agathology and the metaethics of philosophy of religion. Since philosophy concerns itself with metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics, then necessarily any philosophy of, for example, philosophy of science, philosophy of politics, philosophy of law, philosophy of medicine, philosophy of religion, those will also deal with these four perennial areas of philosophical inquiry. So philosophy of religion will also have an ethical component to it, often considering concrete moral dilemmas, which are perennial or contemporary interest. Youthfro dilemma, for example, is an example of the former, and religious exemptions to vaccinations might be an example of the latter. But for any concrete moral dilemma, whether secular, trolley problems, or religious conscientious objectors, those problems will generally have ethical theories behind them: utilitarianism, Kantianism, deontology, divine command theories, virtue ethics, etc. Behind those questions, those theories, will be meta-ethical questions. What is good? How do we know good? Who is good? How do we become good? And of course, answers to those questions will have to have support from a more general ontology, epistemology, and axiology, along with a robust logical apparatus to keep the arguments running. One lesson from this paper is that philosophy of religion has a role to play in answering metaethical questions. Natural agathology has its limits, as Augustine suggests. Philosophy of religion can offer guidance on how to evaluate supernatural answers to the limits of natural agathological questions. Christian philosophers, this can serve as a threefold project. First, Christian philosophers can offer rational philosophical defense of natural knowledge of goodness. Second, we can point out the limits of natural metaethical knowledge. Third, we can offer the solutions from Christian revelation to fill in a natural philosophical lacunae. Fourth, Christian philosophers can offer a comparative polemics in defense of Christian revelation claims vis-a-vis other special revelation claims. This task is especially important in our cultural moment we find ourselves in which philosophers, whether Christian or not, must navigate the treacherous currents between the Scylla of anti-religious dogmatism and the Charybdis of equally anti-rational religious relativism. A robust Christian philosophy of religion with faith-seeking understanding for metaethical questions can be just the apologetic skill needed to be always ready to give an answer, an apologion, to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is within you, with meekness and fear.